Hey everyone! As you can see, I've got my suitcase packed again because we're traveling again today. Norway was amazing last week with the introduction of realism to theater, but it's time to move on to something new. And speaking of new, that's what we're going to talk about today: avant-garde theater. Avant-garde means new and experimental ideas in the arts. These avant-garde forms of theater were reactions to World War I and World War II. Artists were able to express their complicated feelings and the difficult state of the world through theater. They include existential theater, theater of the absurd, and epic theater. By the end of today's lesson, you'll be able to define, describe brief historical backgrounds, list one example of a playwright, and analyze how their plays exemplify each avant-garde theatrical form. Oh, I better hurry up or I'm gonna miss my train! Come on! And here we are at our first stop in France, where we'll begin with our first avant-garde style of theater: existential theater. Existential theater is a movement in theater based on the philosophy of existentialism that focuses on life's subjective experience and the existence of the individual self. Wow, that sounded really complicated. Let's break it down a little bit. If existential theater comes from the philosophy of existentialism, perhaps we should start there. Existentialism emphasizes the importance of the individual's existence against mass society. It focuses on the individual's freedom to choose as well as their responsibility for those choices. According to existentialists, each person chooses their own course in life and creates their own meaning. The struggle of humanity is to achieve self-definition through their choices. Existentialists believed that the important questions of life could not be answered through logic or science. The only certainty of life for them was death. Well, that's not very cheerful. Perhaps that's why existential theater is so often accused of being pessimistic. Existential theater is frequently associated with themes such as death, freedom of choice, and the meaning of existence. According to existential artists, by directly confronting life's dark realities, existential theater is more truthful and authentic. It is not afraid to highlight the illogical and unfathomable human condition. Many existential artists see their art as a rebellious form against society's apathy and false positivity. And where did this rebellious spirit come from? Well, existentialism became very popular in France during and after World War II. The certainty of death became very relatable to the French after France was occupied by the Nazis from 1940 to 1944. French playwrights found existential theater as a way to rebel against the Nazis by stressing the individual's freedom to choose. One of the foremost existential philosophers and playwrights was a man named Jean-Paul Sartre. He was drafted during World War II and imprisoned for 9 months in 1940. During his time as a prisoner of war, Sartre began his playwriting career. He returned to occupied France in 1941 and continued to write. Sartre contributed to illegal magazines and worked with an underground resistance group. In 1944, he wrote No Exit, which is now seen as an iconic example of existential theater. No Exit features 3 characters who have died and are now in the afterlife. It follows existential themes of death, isolation, selfishness, and self-deception. In No Exit, Jean-Paul Sartre explores the idea that mankind's suffering is due to humanity's inability to control the nature of their existence. By not taking responsibility and making positive choices, the characters are now stuck in a torment of their own making. Sartre's plays encourage people to think critically against mass society, take accountability for their actions or non-actions, and reject complacency. And that's our signal to hop back on our train and journey a little farther ahead to right after World War II and our second avant-garde style of theater: theater of the absurd. Theater of the absurd, also called absurdist theater, grew out of existential theater in the late 1950s. Theater of the absurd focuses on the outcome when communication deteriorates and humanity's existence is meaningless, directionless, and purposeless. Theater of the absurd was a reaction to the end of the world wars. After seeing so much senseless death and destruction, Playwrights responded by writing about the pointlessness of existence, without offering any type of solution. Originally, theater of the absurd was tied to small theaters in France. Many absurdist playwrights were French or moved to France from other countries. As theater of the absurd grew, the influence spread to other countries. Because theater of the absurd was an avant-garde, new, movement in the 1950s, many absurdist playwrights did not consider themselves to be absurdists. Historians have used several criteria to now label specific plays and playwrights as being absurd. Typically, theater of the absurd concentrates on the irrationality of the human experience, without suggesting any type of solution. This is the main difference between absurdism and existentialism. In absurdism, there is no moral, no lesson, no easy answers. Absurdism plots are usually not linear. Frankly, they don't make a lot of sense as a story. Sometimes they can feel more like a collection of scenes or episodes that are only unified by a theme or a mood, rather than a story or action. The plays are often written like a circle, beginning and ending with the same lines, like a continuous loop. Usually, absurdist plays use weird events to produce irony or comedy. And while we're on the subject of weird, the characters in absurdist plays are usually very, very weird. They're flat and stereotypical, almost like the commedia types that we learned about in the last unit. They appear to have no logic and are trapped in a situation far beyond their comprehension. Their nonsensical language makes sense to them, but not to the audience. Sometimes, they even use completely made-up words or just sounds. Let's analyze an example from The Bald Soprano by Eugene Ionescu. The Bald Soprano was written in 1948 and was Romanian-born Eugene Ionescu's first play. Similar to Jean-Paul Sartre, Ionescu lived in France during the Nazi occupation in 1942. After France's liberation by the Allies, Ionescu moved to Paris. The Bald Soprano was inspired by Ionescu's struggle to learn English. Like most absurdist plays, the themes are not immediately obvious, but seem to revolve around the breakdown of meaningful communication in modern society. Let's take a look.
Mackenzie is not a good doctor. The operation should have succeeded with both of them, or else both of them should have died.
Why?
A conscientious doctor must die with his patients if they can't get well together. The captain of his ship goes down with his ship into the briny deep. He does not survive alone.
Oh, one cannot compare a patient with a ship.
Well, why not? A ship has its diseases too. Moreover, your doctor is as hale as a ship. That's why he should have perished at the same time as his patient, like the captain in his ship.
Ah, I hadn't thought of that. Perhaps it is true. And then, what conclusion do you draw from this?
All doctors are quacks, and all patients too. Only the Royal Navy is honest in England.
But not sailors.
Naturally.
Wow! Did you feel the chaos in that scene? This is a common thread in theater of the absurd. Usually, the plays feel very chaotic and unrealistic. And, speaking of chaotic, this train station is super chaotic. So, we better get back on board and head to our third avant-garde theater style, epic theater. Epic theater consists of new political dramas, which were a response to the events of the early to mid-1900s. Epic theater is designed to make the audiences think rather than feel, so that when they leave, they will be encouraged to make social and political change. The term epic theater originally came from Irving Piscator in 1924 to 1927. Piscator encouraged playwrights to address contemporary issues. Playwright Bertolt Brecht was strongly influenced by Piscator and developed the epic theater style. He forced the audience to watch plays critically rather than passively through several techniques. The most famous technique is called the Weltfremdungseffekt, or the alienation effect. The alienation effect is designed to make the audience realize that they are watching a play. Remember how realism made the audience fully enveloped in the play so it felt real? Well, the alienation effect did just the opposite through several mediums, such as having actors play multiple characters, rearranging the set in front of the audience, placing lighting equipment in full view, breaking the fourth wall or speaking directly to the audience, using song or music throughout the play, and captioning signs on the stage. Now, Why would epic theater practitioners not want the audience to feel like they're in the world of the play? Well, by stripping away the magic, the audience is forced to confront reality. They cannot escape into a fantasy world. They must think about what they are seeing, which will hopefully spur a reaction once they leave the theater. Let's analyze an example of epic theater with Mother Courage and Her Children by Bertolt Brecht. Brecht was a teenager in Germany during World War I. He was extremely disillusioned by the war and was almost expelled for writing an essay that argued that only fools would die for their country. Brecht fled Nazi Germany in 1933, just after Hitler gained control. He traveled throughout Europe and eventually came to the United States. In 1939, Brecht wrote Mother Courage and Her Children. It was one of 9 plays that Brecht wrote to rebel against rising fascism and Nazism. Mother Courage and Her Children is considered by many to be the greatest anti-war play of all time. It focuses on a mother during the 30 Years' War in Europe from the early to mid-1600s. In the play, Mother Courage loses her 2 sons and daughter to a war that she has tried to profit from. While she seems like a sympathetic character, Brecht does not want the audience to empathize with Mother Courage. He specifically wrote her not to be noble. She commits crimes, collaborates with war criminals, and actively seeks to profit from the war. In his play, Brecht exposes the ugliness of war and that virtues are not rewarded in times of corruption. Brecht utilizes elements of epic theater such as placards that tell what will happen in the scene, actors switching characters and changing costumes on stage, songs, narration, and more. Brecht uses the alienation effect in Mother Courage and Her Children to force the audience to confront the political and social issues rather than getting involved in the emotion of the events. His work seeks to provoke a reaction in the audience so that they will seek revolution and change after they leave the theater. And with that, it's about time for us to leave too. But before we head out, let's review our lesson one more time, starting with existential theater, theater of the absurd, and epic theater. You can now define, describe brief historical backgrounds, list one example of a playwright, and analyze how their plays exemplify each of these avant-garde theatrical forms. Don't forget to check out the practice questions and supplemental PDF for this lesson to prepare for our next class together. We're heading back to the Stars and Stripes with Intro to American Theater! Until then, remember, in theater, like in life, the limit is your imagination! Hey.